Hey,
Hey, calling Chris Anderson in London.
I am in London still. Not in this room actually, but in London.
You
And
look like you're in that room.
I am. And Colin Rick Pryor in. You look like you're in Chicago,
I'm
but
in
I'm.
Chicago, but the real Rick Byers in
Yeah,
Boston. This is
great.
just an avatar. This is a kind of
Avatar.
a ghostly Rick Byer right
Uh,
here.
it's the
But
inflatable Rick Pryor. You
it's
talked
the
about that.
inflatable Rick Byer.
That's right.
And who's also so much more articulate than I am.
And the real Rick Pryor.
Yeah, welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. Chris, where does Stephen Ambrose Tours have tours? Where do they do that?
Oh,
Uh,
everywhere. Europe, Asia,
Use the U.S., the Pacific. Yeah.
the, everywhere,
Check,
all over the place.
if you haven't checked it out, check it out. It's StephenAmbroseTours.com.
Yes, please
And
do.
yeah, whether you're watching live or on replay or listening to the HHH
Oh,
podcast,
oh,
thank you for joining us. Today we'll be learning about the real story behind the legend of Sergeant York. So,
yeah.
yeah, let us know that you're here and what you're drinking. I should just take time to say that we want to thank everybody who supports us via patreon.com.
Absolutely.
And that would be
Where's the list?
especially our top shelf patrons.
Yeah.
And they are awesome people, and there's many of them, but
Yeah.
there's room for more.
Right. And I actually wanted to say that special thank you or welcome to the Currahee Military Museum. And I know they were recent Patreon subscribers, and we really appreciate it, obviously. And it's always good to have um, a wonderful institution like that support us.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've also done a lot for them, and so
Oh,
maybe
happy
a
to.
nice turnaround is fair play there,
Yeah.
kind of thing. Um, we did get a criticism the other day. Somebody wanted to know if the Volstead Act had come to History Happy Hour because we weren't talking about drinking anymore. I do have a little wine here.
Well, I just want to. Well, in our defense, I have to, or in my defense, I have to say that we've been traveling an awful lot, which is why we're doing a lot of these repeats, and they don't stock mini bars in Europe anymore. So I get back to the.
No, and the drinking happens earlier in the evening.
Yeah, that's right. So, but your problem, your comment has duly noted. We plan on fixing that as soon as possible.
Yeah, we're gonna get right to that. So I think we've killed enough time that we should probably get going. So give me a cue and we'll start this show.
Ready?
Okay.
Bing. Okay. There we go.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. Seems like it's been open for a while.
Okay. Yeah, apparently we're really okay. We're gonna get back in practice. We're gonna figure this out. And to all those of you joining us for the first time, sorry. Um, In 1918, acting Corporal Alvin York was credited with single-handedly capturing 132 German soldiers in one of the most famous actions of World War I. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. His story was featured in an Academy Award-winning film starring Gary Cooper. Our guest today, James Gregory, has written a new book that offers an eye-opening challenge to that legend. It's called Unraveling the Myth of Sergeant York, the Other 16, referring to the other 16 soldiers with Alvin York that day in 1918. Unraveling the Myth of Sergeant York. Hey, James, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Well, thanks for having me.
And thanks for being, to not abandoning us in the midst of all the chaos there of our confusion.
So he can watch another show just so he can see the open.
I think you have to keep it up like this moving forward now that you've switched it.
No, negatory.
Right.
And when I'm going to edit it back in and for the recorded version and pretend that this chaos never happened.
Okay.
Like 1984 style. That's my plan. So, James, did you bring a cocktail to our show today?
I did. Very simple. Rum and Coke.
Excellent. I have a nice low-calorie beer, and Chris Anderson's undoubtedly been sucking down the sake, but it is 5 a.m., so we're going to relieve him of the need to have a cocktail.
It still counts as 5 o'clock, though, right?
Yeah,
It's 5 o'clock somewhere. Listen, let's start with the basics. James, what's the story that's come down to us about Alvin York, and what's wrong with it?
Well, the story is basically that he's single-handed. I mean, if you read any book that's been published in the 2000s, you watch the movie, they all say that Alvin York did the entire thing single-handed or almost single-handed, or sometimes they don't even portray that there was anybody else with him. So what we have had for the last 100 years is a simple one man charged up a hill, killed 25 Germans, captured 132, and then brought them all back and saved his men all by himself. And then he was given the Medal of Honor. And life moved on until some other men just popped up and were jealous of his career and jealous of the money and the acclaim he got. And they tried to weasel in and take a little bit of, from him. And so what I wanted to look at was the fact that they weren't weaseling anything, and in fact, they deserved a lot of the credit they wished for.
Okay. Well, so James, it's safe to say one of the kind of the icons of American history. So as a young, kind of starting out academic, what compelled you to say, I'm going to pop one of the biggest stories?
I'm going to step into the firestorm.
Right. If you're starting out in military history, generally, baby steps are a way to go, but you've decided to bust a huge myth. So, what compelled you to do this?
Well, typically I've written on the Marine Corps in World War I. And so it was a friend of mine named Stephen Gerard. He called me one day and said, hey, take a look at this story. It's a YouTube video with some descendants arguing that their family fought with Alvin York. So I thought it would be a fun way to look into the Army side of things. And when I started this, I didn't start with the intention of where it went. I started with the idea that the story is exactly as York tells it, and we just kind of need to mention the other men. But it wasn't until I got a couple years into the research that I started to see all the inconsistencies and the issues with the story, and then it evolved into this. So I didn't intend to try to pop the bubble. It just happened that way.
So you're not going to like do Dan Daly next?
No.
Okay.
No, Dan Daly is not on the
okay,
list.
not on the
So I guess the question is, I mean, there's a lot of ways to approach this, but how does this happen? Okay, so these events take place on, I think it's October 8th in 1918, and these 17 soldiers go out on a mission to silence some machine guns on the left flank, and 6 of them are killed. 11 of them come back with 132 German prisoners. I think that's all. I think that's all pretty solid right there so far. So what happens? How does York get the credit? And is that something that happens right away? Is it something that happens in stages? Is it something that he's grabbing the credit, or is it kind of thrust upon him? That's 4 questions and a big topic.
So leaping right ahead there.
We'll give you at least 20, 30 seconds to kind of put that one together.
Okay, that's fine. Well, I think the whole point, especially of the book, the battle itself is only one chapter, right? The rest of the book is discussing how that process happens. So I think it's a little bit of everything. At the beginning, it's York's the one who gives the report of what happens, because the other 2 officers who were still alive were evacuated. So York is the one that initially brings back the story. But within a year, or actually within 3 months, it's commanding officers that take his story and then transform it to their own gains and save their reputation. And that starts the York myth. And then it's reporters who want to write a really good story, like George Petullo. And then it's authors who see this as an opportunity to further their careers. And then it's Hollywood who furthers it even more. And after so many hands have passed around this story, you get the myth, which we have today. So it went through many iterations as people tried to get a piece of the pie for themselves and twisted it just a little bit.
So James, all right, let's start from the beginning. So I've been to Château Charry many times. Obviously now not in exactly the right spot, but I think I was at least at the spot where he came into the town with the 132 prisoners. There were other people there. So how, I mean, kind of right from the get-go, how is this somebody not saying, hey, wait a minute, whoa. Because, there's other people around.
Right. Well, and some do after the war. There's actually quite a bit of quite a few veterans who speak out after the war that they were in Châtel Chery or they were there, and they saw that it wasn't York in charge.
Right.
But I mean, what happens is the simplest is out of the living 11, York is actually third on the line of who's in command,
Right.
and all three are still alive on the way back. However, Bernard Early and Otis Merrithew are wounded. So when they get to Châtel Chery and they're ordered to take the prisoners further back to Varennes, they get evacuated out. So it's York at the end of the day who's turning in these prisoners and saying, here, we've captured them. And then whenever the investigation comes around for the Medal of Honor, they never ask Early or Merrithew. They're never questioned. They're never brought in for their side of the story. They're just kind of pushed out. And in fact, Early was actually evacuated back to the States. So it was just Merrithew who was still in France, and they never asked him. So it was just the fact they weren't there to defend themselves at the beginning. And I think that plays a really big part in it.
Okay. All right, now Rick has silenced himself like he generally does.
Well, I'm desperately trying to find those things that I haven't that I didn't have at the beginning that I need to.
Want me to ask a question?
So you ask another question, Chris.
Okay. So one of the things that actually I found really interesting about the book was in the description of the other members of the patrol. Talk a little bit about who these other people were. You've mentioned two already, but names and a bit about their background, because I think it speaks to what the American Expeditionary Force was and what the American Army was at that time.
Sure. Well, all 17 are from the 82nd, and the 82nd is made up of people from all over the country. But for this 17, I mean, you've got two Italians, 2 Irish, 3 Polish, a Native American, for European Americans.
Yeah.
All right. So you've got a mix here of immigrants who have only been in the country maybe 5-6 years. When they go overseas, the majority of them, there's this big discussion on, even with the 82nd, that there's still kind of the issues from the Civil War. So you have Southern officers and Northern troops, and this thing that there might be some contention. But it's just a mix. I mean, you've got York, who is backwoods in the mountains, and then you've got Michael Cecina. He's Italian. He's living in the middle of New York, right? So you've got a wide variety of men who are either coming from the countryside, coming from the cities. Percy Beardsley is one who plays a big role in the battle, and they tend to forget. They always say, "Oh, Alvin York's a marksman. He grew up hunting, and he is a great shot."
Right.
Well, Percy Beardsley was too. He grew up on a farm. He grew up shooting competitions, and he was a great shot as well. Right. So there's all these people that have past that help them a lot in the battle. People just don't want to discuss, and the fact that they're immigrants, I think, led to the officers taking advantage of them, especially during the investigation, pretending they don't know English. Things like that. So there's the wide variety of them. I mean, I can list them. But you've got Bernard Early, Otis Merrithew, Thomas Johnson. He's from Lynchburg, Virginia, which Desmond Doss later.
Yep.
Michael Cecina, Mario Musi, both of them are wounded. Marion Demowski, William Wine. There's 17 of these guys, and majority of them are not born in the United States. So I think that does really feel to the AEF and the 82nd in general. It's an amalgamation of these men all fighting for the same cause.
Yeah.
But is it also... Go ahead.
I was just going to make a snarky comment. So
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I was really very happy with the fact that while many of them were from other parts of the world, that a lot of them were living in New England at the time.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. What I was going to say, but isn't some of this also maybe a discounting of these immigrants being part of the reason that York, he's the salt of the earth. He's a man of devout religious convictions. American, coming up from the rural countryside. That he is kind of a great figure to make a hero, and he's not even. I mean, Sergeant York is such a great phrase, but it's actually Acting Corporal York, which doesn't have quite the ring to it.
Yeah, or PFC York, right? That's
Yeah,
the issue.
yeah.
He never, that has always bothered me, and people that write about it, they say the newly appointed corporal, he was never a corporal. He never officially held that rank, right? But you're right, it doesn't have the same ring to it. I actually had a chapter that the publisher had me cut about myth making and kind of that exact discussion on how did York become this folk hero. And the ultimate answer is that, especially at this time, that people really love to see your down home Americans, but they beat the army at their own game, right? If Samuel Woodville is the perfect American soldier, Alvin York beat him. He's the perfect American soldier who's not an American soldier, and that's why he's a folk hero, and people really flock to that.
Right.
And then I think the religion aspect also really pushed it over the top.
And the conscientious objector, so I don't. Is that even true that he was a
Yeah,
conscientious
he
objector?
actually he tried to get out of it 2 or 3 times. So he was a conscientious objector, and he applied once, denied, applied again, was denied, and I'm not sure if he tried a third time or not, but he did try at least 2 to get out of the draft and to stay out of the army. So that part is true.
Okay. So, all right. So let's kind of start with the spark for this story. He comes out of the woods. All these prisoners, 2 people ahead of him are wounded. They're evacuated. How does this start? How does this? Hey, I know what we're going to do here.
Well, it's what the way I argue it is that it's just York, and you got to think about it. There are not many Medal of Honor recipients most people can mention, right? Sam Sampler's from Oklahoma. He got his Medal of Honor the exact same day on 8 October, but no one knows about him. So why was the original answer?
Yeah.
And it went past York. He got the DSC, and the story could have ended there, right? No harm, no foul. But in December, it was his commanding officers, George Duncan, who commanded the 82nd. He sent a letter to George Petullo, who was writing for the Saturday Evening Post, and said, hey, you need to come meet this man and tell his story. And George Duncan basically became York's press agent. He was always with York. He sent York on a talking tour around France in 1919 to tell everyone about his story. So he brings in George Petullo, and then they take George Petullo out to the investigation for the Medal of Honor. He writes a story. Right? Yeah, right. The investigation in air quotes. He writes this article focusing on that he was a conscientious objector and that he became this hero. But George Duncan had the final say. So I actually did get a copy of George Petullo's original draft, where you can see him changing the numbers of dead Germans and changing other pieces because George Duncan had to okay it before it could be published. So his commanding officers are the ones manipulating all of this to create the story, which then creates York as this hero.
Okay. So is it my turn, Rick, or you?
I don't know, but you're on a roll.
Well, I mean, I'm just gonna throw this out here because Nancy Nylance has asked this, and Nancy asked, "Did York himself ever try to dispel the myth?" And I don't want to get too far forward, but at the beginning, is anybody saying like, well, "Wait a minute"?
No, and it's a big contention, especially with people that have written about York in the past. They like to claim that he did, but he really didn't. The one that most of them try to reference is, he was on a radio show in 1941, and he said, "I couldn't have done it without the other men." But that was the night before the movie premiered. So I think it was just calming tensions. But before that, the only time he would mention the other men is if someone deliberately asked him a question. And even then he would just, give him a throwaway comment. Oh yeah, they were there. Or, I don't know what they did. He only brought one man on stage with him. That was Otis Merrithew, right after the war, because Otis just happened to be in Boston. After that, he never once brought any of the men on stage. He never mentioned them in interviews. And in fact, whenever he was supposed to go to New England for talking tours, he would avoid the towns the men were in. And there are several moments where he scheduled a meeting and they told him, hey, we invited, Percy Beardsley. He lives near here. And then all of a sudden he can't do it. So he never went to any town where the other men were. And it seems he was purposely avoiding them.
Okay. So a question I feel it's important to ask is, how do you know that they aren't just jealous people who want to claim some credit because they've seen this soldier that they served with become nationally known and he's getting money for his Bible school, or people buy him a house and they do all this stuff. So how do we know, or what's the evidence that started to convince you as you started researching this story to know, wait a minute, there is a real other version of this?
Well, first off, I mean, just as a historian, if there's 11 survivors, right? If you read any book about York, they only ever use York. They never once thought, hey, why don't we ask the other 10 survivors, and why are their perspectives not involved in the story? So,
That's a
people's
clue, yeah.
yeah, right. But when they're jealous, I don't see that because they don't say anything. They make a few comments when they get home with local newspapers, like, yeah, I was there and we were kind of pushed out. But they don't say anything. Throughout the 1920s, when he gets his house, when he gets the money, no one says a word. They just go home, they live their lives. That's it. It's not until 1927 when another veteran from a different company mentions it to the American Legion after they wrote an article about York. Hey, you forgot the 16 other men. That's the very first time the other men are put in the national spotlight. It's not their prerogative. They didn't do it. And when you fast forward to like the movie, all the books that do talk about them say they're just jealous for money. I've seen the original letter that Merrithew wrote to Warner Brothers. It never mentions money. Money is never brought up. All they ask for is to be shown in the movie in the battle. They want their roles represented.
Well,
That's all they ever ask for.
And I want to get to the movie a little later. And I can't remember if that particular letter is reprinted, but you do reprint some of the letters in the book, which is one of the things that's certainly very convincing. Is you're actually looking at some of the documents there. But there's an incident that happens, I think it's in 1929, that also kind of brings this to the fore, where the Army is we're gonna recreate Sergeant York's heroic moment, and we're gonna bring together all the survivors, and so that they can help tell us what happened or be part of it. And the survivors are like, yeah, maybe this is a good time for us to tell people that this really didn't happen the way you say it happened. And that sort of is the first kind of media firestorm, right? I mean, this isn't new. This is 90 years ago. Pardon, Chris?
Don't we call it a shitstorm?
I was gonna say shitstorm, and then I just really wanted to not say it.
Oh well, sorry.
But shitstorm is, yes. I mean, that's the first of many shitstorms in this story.
Yeah, 1929 is because again, York is the one who's told everyone his version of events. That he was the one who did it alone. So when the Army did the investigation, again in air quotes, that was the basis for everything. So in 1929, they decide to do the War College event, reenact York, and they think it'll be a great PR stunt to bring out the other men to the event because they're going to back York up. And then it turns into this horrible show because they start to realize, one, when they research it, that the accounts don't match and it's impossible to retell the battle exactly as it happened because even York admits he doesn't know what happened. But when the media gets to the other men and they see the opportunity to tell their story, that story is not the side the Army wants to project. And then, as you know, it evolves to the major part of the shit show is that when the War Department has to admit that they buried recommendations for the other men early on in the 20s. And now they have to say, oh, we do actually have documents that prove the other men were more involved than we previously let on.
Oops. And they actually give Bernard Early, who is actually the sergeant, Sergeant Early. They award him a DSC at that point, correct?
Yeah, that's the moment where the War Department, which I should mention this, so George Duncan and Julian Lindsay, the 328th Regiment commanding officer in the 82nd, they used York early on to save their careers. Well, after the war in the 1920s, they both end up in the War Department. So who's the officers that receive those recommendations for the other men? It's Duncan again, right? So then he buries it. And when they have to admit it, they say, oh, yes, it turns out Early was recommended for the DSC, but so sorry for everybody else. We can't give you medals because the congressional, the time limit. So you're out of luck.
Expiration date.
Right. So then he buries it. And when they have to admit it, they say, oh, yes, it turns out Early was recommended for the DSC, but so sorry for everybody else. We can't give you medals because the congressional, yeah, the time limit. So you're out of luck.
Yeah.
But yes, they do end up giving Early, which is that photo, give Early his DSC at this event. But the very last day, so that they would basically, as one reporter put it, they were just dragging along the other men to try to keep their mouths shut, with this pretending they're going to give them awards and they don't. So the War Department was really trying to
They just
save
kind
their
of
own butts.
dig that hole pretty deep, don't they?
Yeah,
It
yeah, a little bit.
doesn't put the War Department and some of the officers of the Army in a very good light at that point.
No, it doesn't, especially if you read the news articles from earlier that week where these same officers are saying disparaging things about the other men. I mean, one of them even says that Early probably deserved to get shot because he was always jumping up when he shouldn't. And so they were saying horrible things about the other men. And then at the end, when they had to admit that they had these recommendations, all of a sudden those same people are changing their tune and saying, oh, well, yeah, I wrote the recommendation, so I'm going to go ahead and put my name on it. And everything's great. But it's
No, it was a happier, simpler time.
So, but one of the when people question this story, or even now, I guess when people maybe you can question your book, they're going to say, but there was an investigation into the action, and so I think it's important that you talk about that investigation because you found out some interesting things about it. Because that's the basis of the medal award, right?
Right. Well, and that's every single person I've either argued with online or that want to question my work. They always say, well, the Army did an investigation. They have affidavits. Well,
Right.
first, I mean, an affidavit is one person's perspective on what happened. There is no single affidavit. What they did was George Duncan took York, only York, and they interviewed, quote unquote. They asked York his statement. York, what happened? York told them, they wrote it down. They took it to the other men, or at least 6 of the men, and said, here, sign this. And then they took that, went and did the investigation on the site of the ground, and then gave York the Medal of Honor. So what I found, thinking, okay, these are going to be the be all end all. My argument's going to die right here. And then I realized that the investigation is 3 days. Right? It's only 3 days. So it's the 5th, 6th, or 4th, 5th, and 6th, or one of those 3. Well, the affidavits are signed on February 6th. They don't go out to the site to do the investigation until February 7th, which means they had already made up their minds, written up the documents, signed them before they even went out to do the investigation. And then they gave York the Medal of Honor. So it's 3 total days, February 5th, 6th, and 7th. Then I dug a little deeper, and it said that some of the men, like Fyodor Sok and Joseph Kornacki, their signatures were an X. And now both men, after the war, claimed that they did not sign those documents. So when I started looking at it, their answer was, or the Army's answer was, that they're illiterate immigrants. And that's why they signed an X for their name. Well, then I went and dug. I found Fyodor Sok's draft registration card where he had signed his name. He had beautiful handwriting. Then I went and dug a little more. Now, Joseph Kornacki, he did sign with an X on his draft registration card, which could have proven my point, or proven their point. But they're in the 82nd. The 82nd Division is made up of a lot of immigrants. So the Army established an English school at Camp Gordon and made them go to this school during their training so that they could learn basic English and learn how to sign their name. So by the time the investigation happens, these men know how to sign their name. They went to school for it. So those 2 documents that are signed with an X, to me, are null and void. They're just made up. So you add all these things, it just shows this investigation was a sham put on by Duncan and Lindsay as a way to give York the Medal of Honor they wanted him to have anyway.
But there's that picture of York on, quote unquote, on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
They took him there.
It's there, but they only took York. They didn't take any of the other men.
Right.
They didn't ask anyone what happened. They just took York and said, okay, York, show us around, show us what you did. And then they had target practice and they competed with each other to see who was the better shot.
Well, one of the things I've always wondered about that picture is it's taken like not too far into the woods.
Yeah, it's on the right spot. It is on the right spot.
I just always thought York was walking through the woods. He's like, it's just too far of a walk. So yeah, it happened right here.
No, I will give them that credit that they were, because the 2 photos which Rick you have of the graves,
Yes,
those were taken at the same time. So they are in fact in the ravine at the correct spot when they take that photo of York.
And these are the graves of the people who were killed during the action, and they're temporary graves that are still there in 1919.
Yeah, 5 of them. William Wine was buried. He died pretty far back, so they didn't get a photo of him. But yes, so they took these photos at the same time. So at least they were there. And you know, some of the men like Buxton they took later. He went and he's the one who drew a map of like how they got there, which is what we found in the National Archives to help prove our point that that was the correct site.
Is this map kind of based on that?
It is, yes. That map is based off of Buxton's map, so you can see where G Company came from, and then down. And so on the left side, right in the middle, where you can see the 3 burial spots. So that's the easiest answer for where the battle happened. Follow the bodies. They didn't move the bodies; they buried them where they fell. So right there in that ravine is the site. Now, if you go to Châtel Cherie and you follow that trail, it goes to the wrong spot, which is 600 meters north, up there near where the D is. But that is the
I'm
correct
looking
map.
for the D. The D in Dame.
Yes.
Dame Bane. I can't even.
Yeah.
My eyes aren't good enough to see.
But that's where the trail leads you to right now that Mastriano put up. But
well, we should mention to everybody who's joined us that we are chatting today about the book Unraveling, the Myth of Sergeant York, the Other 16 by James Gregory. And James is a PhD candidate. He'll be a PhD by the end of the year, pretty sure.
Yeah.
And he's written extensively on World War One. I want to talk. You mentioned Mastriano. That's Doug Mastriano, another writer historian, and we want to kind of get to that controversy. But I wanted to just bring up the movie for a second. I think that probably 92.7% of the people who know about Sergeant York know about him through the portrayal in the movie. It won several Academy Awards. It was nominated for 9 or 10 Academy Awards. And you have a chapter about this, and it's really fascinating because the other soldiers kind of see this as an opportunity to get their story out there, but Hollywood just wants to buy them off and build up the Sergeant York myth. And once again, these guys are kind of led along a primrose path and then kind of discarded at the end of the path. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So that movie, I think, is always really nice to mention that this is the first time Hollywood has done a biography of a living person. So the rules were off. They didn't really know what to do. And so what they established with York was that he had full override. So if he didn't like the movie, his contract stated he could kill the whole project. So Warner Brothers was making sure to cater to what York wanted. And the movie, to his credit, he didn't want it to be about the war. He wanted it to be about his life and his religious journey. But they changed it. They added a few characters like Puller or whatever his name is. They threw him in there. But it was early on when news got around that this movie was being made, and some of the other survivors realized that no one had called them or no one had contacted them about this. So Otis Merrithew wrote a letter to Warner Brothers saying, I hear you're going to make this movie. There were 16 of us. We want to make sure that you get us our perspective, our role in the battle. And then Warner Brothers started to panic, trying to figure out what to do. Jack Warner wanted to just ignore them and not include them at all, but their legal team kind of said, we have to at least get signatures for their portrayal in the movie. So it sparks this search to track down the men and get them to sign off on these contracts so they can be portrayed in the movie. And the men sign with the understanding that perhaps they will actually get their role in the movie correct, and then they don't, and it basically rewrites the history and pushes all the men out. But like you said, Warner Brothers just wanted to pay them off. And they did so very manipulatively. They manipulated all the men. They used their financial situation. Some of them were suffering from PTSD, and they used that to their advantage to pay them $5. I mean, Patrick Donahue, he got the Purple Heart. He was wounded that day, and he got a Silver Star for the battle. They paid him $5. And in comparison, they paid Captain Danforth, who was not a part of the patrol. He did not fight in that ravine. They paid him $1,500 for his part in the movie. So there was a lot of this trying to keep the men out of it and keep them away from set so that they could make York happy and tell the York story they wanted.
Oh, so let's move forward, though. So now you could say that there's been recent work done on York, and people continue to look at it. What are some of the modern efforts to kind of sustain this myth, and why do you think it's had the longevity that it has?
Well, it's had the longevity just because the Army really dove into it. I mean, they've got a state park is named after him. There's no denying his cultural impact. And a lot of people think that I hate York, and I don't. I respect him, what he did after the war, as far as, bettering his community and his, all to him, right? Commend him for everything. He was a good man. But the perpetuation is because the story is just so popular. It's such a good story. And with Hollywood and then authors wanting to get a bit of it for themselves over the years, it kind of died out by the 90s. And it wasn't until Douglas Mastriano's book in 2006. Oh, actually, his book came out in 2013. So 2006 is when he started his research. And at the same time, Dr. Tom Nolan started his research to find the actual site. So 100 years, almost 100 years later, people want to find where it actually occurred. And that leads to two different routes. Mastriano wins out in the popularity contest. So his book is published in 2013, and a new generation is shown the Sergeant York story. Problem is, Mastriano does a horrible job at writing his book, and he uses bad sources. He's fraudulent in many of his sources. He makes up a lot of information, but people buy into it because he does have a PhD and he does print from a university, and that's the end of the story. While you've got others like Dr. Tom Nolan and his team that are using actual archaeology and correct processes and looking at the archival material and find the actual site, but their story is pushed out.
Well,
and then it dies.
Sorry.
No, you're good. I mean, after that, it's over because now Mastriano has taken it, and even the latest book before mine, James Nelson's The York Patrol, was just the same thing. It was York's story.
I want to break this down a little bit
Sure.
For people because we've just thrown a lot at them. So Doug Mastriano, first of all, is a name that some people may have heard of, even if they're not familiar with Sergeant York. He is a state senator from Pennsylvania. He is an ally of President Trump's. He ran for governor of Pennsylvania in 2022 on the Republican ticket and lost. And you've taken substantial issue, as you talk about, with the underlying research on his book, and you have actually reached out to the University of New Brunswick. Is that's
Yes.
the Canadian university where he went to, where he got his PhD, and said you should re-examine this PhD thesis. It's got 150 errors in it. It's filled with fraud, etc. And that has moved forward. I mean, you've gotten some response on that. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, and again, I didn't start this to burst the bubble and attack people. I actually talked to Mastriano. He was my main source because, again, he had a PhD. He published with the University Press of Kentucky. Why wouldn't I use him? So I wrote an article on the other 16, and he and I had talked multiple times on Facebook. And then when my article came out, he blocked me. He didn't want to talk to me anymore. But I used him as a source. And then I got a message from a man named Brad Posey, who was actually, he worked with Mastriano and he worked with Tom Nolan, and he did all the German research. And he reached out to me and said, hey, you're wrong. Some of the things you say here are not correct. Here's the documentation to prove it. And that made me start rethinking Mastriano. And I used him as source, which now means my work is tainted, and so is every other historian that's ever used him as a source. Their work is tainted.
Every other historian and tour guide.
And tour guide. Their work is tainted because of him. And so when I looked at his book, I found a bunch of cases.
You're not taking this at all personally, are you, Chris?
No, not at all.
Just checking.
Well, his book had a lot of issues. And then I found out that his book came from his PhD. So I tried to get his PhD.
Which was kept secret for a long time.
They was under embargo for like 15 years, which is ridiculous. It should only remain under embargo for 2. So they wouldn't give it to me. So that started this big issue. the university wouldn't do anything. And then last year, secretly, they release his dissertation. They bring it out. So then I got my hands on it. And I started going through every single one of his footnotes. And I found 235 examples of fraud. And when I say fraud, I mean, he'll say a quote, Otis Merrithew said, "I love York, we're best friends." And he'll quote a telegram. Well, if you go read that telegram, all it says is, "I will be there Saturday. Best, I love you." Right? That's all it said. So he's just making up statements. He's making up material and then throwing a random citation on it to pretend like he knows what he's talking about, which is a academic fraud. And since it taints all of us, that needs to be something that is taken up against. And a lot of people, have been angry with me for that too. Why would I attack this man and his integrity? Well, as a historian in academia, we owe it to ourselves to make each other uphold that same level that we do. We're supposed to be telling the truth as to the best of our abilities to what our sources say. And for someone to commit fraud like that and then get famous off of it, I mean, that's how he got his career at the Army War College. He gained a lot. His whole career is based off this, and it's all a fraud. And since a lot of people have read his book, a lot of people have this misconception about the story. And so that's what I'm trying to combat. It's not York. It's the fact that Mastriano is another one of these guys using York for his own personal gains.
You don't have to sugarcoat it for us.
I'm not one for sugarcoating.
If you believe it, commit. Of course, Senator Mastriano argues that any assault on his research is politically motivated and an attack by the left wing. Are you part of a left wing conspiracy here?
No, and I get that a lot, that this is all political. I live in Oklahoma. I don't care about Pennsylvania politics. They don't interest me, and I have no say in it. But no, I would, consider myself a Republican, and I've talked with him before. Right? We were friendly. I have nothing against him politically. It's purely the facts of the matter. I show when I sent in my report, I was angry because UNB ignored me the first time. So the second time, when I sent the bigger one, I went through and listed every single example and then attached every single document that I quoted so that there was no question about it. Because if we don't have academic integrity, we have nothing as scholars. So it has to be upheld.
I agree, but I'm also making a note. Don't piss off James Gregory.
As long as you do good work, there's no issue.
Hey, I could send you some information on the ghost army, James. You might want
to. Please don't go researching the ghost army. Hey, Chris, can I follow up once here?
Absolutely.
Do you mind?
No.
Because the other person you brought up is Dr. Tom Nolan, and Dr. Tom Nolan is a historical geographer at Middle Tennessee State University, and he's led a team that's visited twice to this area and done some research. And we have a few graphics that you supplied for us, and maybe you can kind of give us, without getting overly complicated, help explain why they both sort of prove where the location of the action is, and also prove that it's not just Sergeant York as the only American who's engaged in combat in this action.
Sure, absolutely. And it's clear because this will be different than what's there. So if you've been to Chateau Chery, there's a trail that Mastriano put up, which is about 600 yards to the north of where Dr. Tom Nolan was. So yeah, whatever one you want to pull up.
Well, which one would you want to start with? The Germans?
I'd like to do this one. So
I can do it another way.
No, this is perfect. This is the
we're spontaneous here.
So if you look at it this way, I mean, Dr. Nolan and his team, they sat down and they went through the archives. They went and found, Buxton's material when he drew the map to show where they went. And if you even follow the 82nd Division history, it'll tell you how to get to the site. So they did that. They came to this area and this ravine, and they took metal detectorists, they took archaeologists, and they sat down and did 100% sweep of this ravine. And so that blue spot you see in the middle is a dam, an old medieval dam. So what they found were hundreds and hundreds of artifacts, but this map shows 30-06 expended, so obviously fired by American soldiers. And obviously not a single man fired all of these unless York is the Flash and he can speed through the entire ravine, firing and moving and firing and moving. And this is just what they were able to find. I mean, it was 100 years. Things that get lost, things get rusted.
And
And
you have another one that is the American equipment of various kinds.
This is a good one because the only American equipment they found is the material that was left on the buried men. So what you're looking at is actually the graves. So the one there next to the dam on the right side, that's Murray Savage's grave. Top left, that's William Wine. And then the other spot south of the dam, that is the four-man grave. So the photos we showed earlier, because it's American equipment being utensils and a helmet, boot heels, things like that were there where the men were buried. So this, I think, and they even found a collar disc that said 328 Company G. And on some of the utensils, it was stamped 328 Company G, the unit of York and his men, which once you take this, you compare that with the archaeology, and then you go look at the grave registration files, they also point out, like Murray Savage's, it says he is 15 yards east of the creek, 5 yards south of the dam. So the grave registration files also confirm that's where the bodies were. And this is what Mastriano ignored in his book. He never mentions the bodies. He never mentions the grave registration because it proves he's wrong. So that's what we're seeing here. These are where the bodies were.
And we have and just to show one more, just since we have it here, and I meant to start with this one, but this is a wider shot. It doesn't map up quite as exactly, but you can still see the dam there. And this is the German firing. So obviously, and obviously they're way outnumbered. There's a lot of that, though. That action is still right in that same area.
Right. So, and this is a much more zoomed out. So what you see like on the most northern part of this image, that's actually a different machine gun nest from a wholly, on their way out, they captured it. But the main part, if we look near the dam, you can basically see a crescent shape of the expended cartridges, which shows where the Bavarians actually that were on the slope that opened fire on York and his men. So you can see how outnumbered they truly were, but they had the element of surprise on their side. And, during the fight, they managed to convince them all to surrender, but they were wholly outnumbered in this. And I also want to use this to point out, a lot of the stories say that, Alvin York knocked out 13 machine guns or something. There was no evidence in the ravine of a machine gun being set up. You would find a giant pile of expended cartridges. They weren't. There were none. So what we think happened, one, if you're in a tiny ravine and you have 50 men open fire with their rifles, it's going to sound like a machine gun. I mean, it's just deafening. But also, they did have a machine gun there. They found evidence of the clips and pieces of a machine gun, but we don't believe they had time to set it up before they opened fire. So there is no charge up the hill. There is no silencing 15 machine guns because there was not a single machine gun firing on the Americans in that ravine. And the archaeology confirms that by not having a spot with a machine gun where it could have been.
So, James, one of the other things I think is that I found impressive and also touching in the book was the role of the families of the other 16, because you have there's nobody that can argue with the documentation that you have in the book and the references that you have, and a lot of that has come from these families. So could you talk a little bit about what the descendants of these families did in regards to this story and what they did to keep the memory of their relatives alive?
Sure. Well, and the heart of it is that the other men, really tried to hold on as long as they could. And Otis Merrithew in particular kept every document through his entire life. Even his original wound tag from when he was in the hospital, he kept it. And all of these documents were saved by the families. And in 2008, Bob D'Angelo, he's the great nephew of Bernard Early, he decided to start getting the descendants together to see if other families had stories like his family did about their role in the battle. So he managed to gather quite a few of the descendants. They shared documents with each other. They shared photographs with each other. And they tried to get the word out, which is how I first got into it. That YouTube video was the descendants speaking at some local TV station. Well, they actually contacted Mastriano, and they sent him the material, and he just ignored it. And it wasn't until the archaeology came about. Well, I'm archaeology in air quotes for him. When he found all these 45 casings, and then he said, well, these are all Alvin York's. He fired 27 bullets, and then they found 32 casings. So then he realized, oh, well, I guess someone else must have been firing a pistol. So then he reached out to the families again and said, okay, I kind of believe you now. Can I have your information? And they said no. So the families tried, and they were squashed by Mastriano as well. They did go out to the site with Dr. Nolan. They did provide Nolan with a lot of the research. But Mastriano, by that point, had just too much clout on his end, too much weight of his opinion, and they never went anywhere. And so when I got involved with the story, it took about 2 years to convince the families that I wasn't here to screw them over like other authors had done in the past. Even James Nelson in his book, he reached out to the families and they didn't want to work with him. So they finally opened up to me and they gave me access to everything. And it was that treasure trove of documentation that proved the entire story. Otis Merrithew's documents, every letter he mailed to Warner Brothers, every letter he got from Warner Brothers, letters to commanding officers in the 20s, letters in between the men. It revealed that the things the descendants were trying to tell everyone were true, and that it went against the common grain of the story, that these are not jealous men. These are not men who want money and fame. They just want their story told. They just want to be a part of the story, in which many of them died and were wounded for. So without the families, I could not have written this book, which is why it was so important to me to have an epilogue in there written by Bob D'Angelo to talk about his work and the family's work.
Yeah.
And speaking of the families, you have this great photo in the book. Can you explain to us what this photo is?
Yeah, so in I'm going to get the year wrong, 65, Otis Merrithew, and this is right after Alvin York had passed away, Otis Merrithew tried one last time, and he wrote a letter to President Lyndon B. Johnson telling him who he was and, you know, the fact that the Army would not give him any medals. He was actually recommended for the DSC, but it was past the deadline. So they never awarded him anything. So he wrote to Johnson, and Johnson agreed, and they opened up his file, and they found that, oh, you're telling the truth, that you were actually recommended for a medal, which the War Department back in the 30s told him, we have no record of that. So they were lying to him back then. So what they ended up doing was Lyndon Johnson ordered them to award Merrithew with the Silver Star. So this photograph is from that event in 65 with his grandson, Jimmy Fallon, not the Jimmy Fallon Tonight Star. And so this photo is taken at that event, and Jimmy is holding his grandfather's Silver Star in his hand. And Merrithew was so proud of this photo, he actually sent it to President Johnson as a gift, and Johnson returned it with a thank you note, you know, but you need to keep this. So this was a very special photo for the family and for Merrithew.
So I think, you know, we've been talking about all this a lot, but briefly, based on your research, what happened in the ravine?
Based on my research, first, again, we'll never know. None of us will ever know, right? Fog of war. But I looked at the German records. I've looked at the American records. So what happened was Early led the group. He led them into this ravine.
That's Sergeant, I just want to say that's Sergeant Bernard Early.
Yes, Acting Sergeant Bernard Early. So he leads these 17, which alone, I mean, he was sent on a suicide mission, right? Who would send 17 men to knock out, you know, multiple machine guns? But he leads the men safely through the woods into the ravine. They come across a bunch of Germans eating breakfast. So he orders his men to spread out, and they open fire. And they kill several of the Germans. They all throw their hands up. So they stop firing. They move in. Early orders York, because York is actually commanding a Shosho automatic rifle squad. So he orders York and Percy Beardsley with the Shosho to watch over as they take the weapons away from the Germans. They line them all up, and then a command is shouted of get down. The Germans all drop to the ground, and some Bavarian sappers who were just slightly up the ridge, unnoticed by the patrol, open fire. And that's when they killed the 6 men. You know, those stories are in between. If you read most of the stories, they say like Murray Savage was ripped apart by a machine gun. That's not true. You know, he was shot in the stomach, things like that. But 6 of the men are wounded or killed outright, and the rest get to cover. So York is already in an advantageous position because he was covering everyone. There's a show automatic rifle right behind him who's returning fire. Alvin York's returning fire. 4 of the men are guarding the prisoners. Merrithew is firing back until he's shot in the arm. Then he pulls out his revolver and keeps fighting. So all of the other men, they're not just cowering behind bushes like most stories say. They're actively engaged in the fighting, which the archaeology shows. And it's during this that the commanding officer, German commanding officer, Paul Vollmer, surrenders. He says stop. He blows his whistle, and he says, yes, so this is a commissioned artwork. And what we did was, in this artwork, we actually used the archaeology to put the men where they would have been. So Alvin York is actually on the right side. You see the show, and then he's just above him in the bushes, which is where York said he was, in the bushes beside a tree. So they open fire. The fighting lasts maybe 10, 15 minutes at most. The Bavarians surrender, and all of a sudden, these Americans have 80 to 90 German prisoners. So they line up everybody up. Otis Merrithew is wounded in the arm, but he's been given control by Bernard Early. Early has been shot 5 times, and one of the accounts says he had a hole in his back so big that you could see his kidney. So Early gave Merrithew command of the patrol, and York is at the head of the column, and they march out. And on their way out, they actually capture a few more Germans, different nests. So by the time they get back to the ravine, they have 132 German prisoners. Early is being carried out on a stretcher by German prisoners. Merrithew's arm is bloody, and he's still barking orders. Donahue has been hit in the shoulder by shrapnel. Mario Musi has been hit in the shoulder by a bullet. So you have this just ragged group of Americans, 11, walking out with 132 Germans. And then the wounded men are evacuated. York continues leading the column to Varennes, turns over the troops, and receives credit. So the one thing is that York I'm not saying York didn't do anything. York is a big part of this battle. He was in the best position. He didn't charge up the hill. There is no bayonet charge. They charged York and he shot him from back to front like a turkey shoot. That never happened. That was made up in the 1920s by Samuel Cohen in his book. But what I like to say is that the patrol would not have made it out of that ravine if it wasn't for York, but York wouldn't have made it out of that ravine if it wasn't for the patrol. Same thing with any one of them. Percy Beardsley, he had a show automatic rifle, for God's sakes, and they were all actively involved. It took all of them to get out of that ravine. Not a single-handed story, one man. No, it was all of them, and they all deserve the credit for what they did in that role.
Well, we want to thank James Gregory for joining us today to talk about his quite fascinating book, Unraveling the Myth of Sergeant Alvin York, The Other 16, which I'm sure has engendered no controversy or disagreement with you whatsoever. I did see in the comments we have a few of you sadly disappointed viewers who, have had their illusions stripped from them. Thanks a lot, James. But it's a really worthwhile book to read, and I think you really have done a good job trying digging into the facts on this. So thank you so much, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, James. Good luck.
Thanks for having me.
Dig a deep foxhole.
Well, next week on History Happy Hour, the topic is pie.
Oh, and that's that's a good topic.
Yeah, we're gonna do another encore episode. Promise the last one for a bit. And we'll revisit our program with Rossi Anastopoulos, who's the author of Sweet Land of Liberty, A History of America in 11 Pies. It was kind of a filling show, Chris, even for a crusty guy like you. Oh.
Before you say, why are we doing this? Oddly, this was one of our most widely watched shows.
Yeah.
I love this show. It was great.
Yeah, it was a fun show, and so come back and check it out. If you missed it the first time, or if you just want to relive the experience next week, join us for that, please. And guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse. What the hell's our website? historyhappyhour.com.
.com.
.com.
Thanks, everybody. Safe.